I wasn't looking for giants when I found the first article. I was researching 19th century archaeology, the early excavations, the mound explorations that dotted the American landscape before professional institutions took control of what could and couldn't be discovered. Standard historical research, the kind of thing you do when you're trying to understand how we understood ourselves before the narratives were standardized, before the textbooks were written, before certain questions became professionally dangerous to ask. But then I found the newspaper clippings, not one or two anomalies you could dismiss as journalistic exaggeration, hundreds published in mainstream newspapers across the country with the casual confidence of reporters documenting something unusual but not unbelievable. Giant human skeletons 70, 89 feet, sometimes more, exposed in burial mounds in caves during railroad construction and riverbank erosion after spring floods, exposed, reported, and then somehow collectively forgotten, as if an entire category of archaeological discovery simply ceased to matter. The New York Times, May 4, 1912, the report describing the excavation of 18 giant skeletons in southwestern Wisconsin. The bones were described as enormous, the skulls unusually thick, the jawbones large enough to fit over the face of a normal man like a mask. This wasn't a tabloid chasing sensational headlines. This was the paper of record, the same publication that covered presidential elections and international wars, documenting a discovery that by any reasonable standard should have rewritten anthropology textbooks and redirected archaeological research for generations. But it didn't. The skeletons were sent away for study. The story faded from public attention. And if you search for follow-up coverage, for the academic papers that should have resulted from such a significant find, for the museum displays that should have followed, for any institutional acknowledgement that 18 enormous human skeletons, you find nothing, just silence, as if the discovery never happened, as if 18 sets of remains, measuring well beyond normal human proportions, simply ceased to exist once they left the ground that had preserved them. The pattern repeats with unsettling consistency across decades of newspaper archives. The San Diego Union, August 1895. Giant skeleton discovered during excavation work. The bones described as those of a man who must have stood at least 8 foot tall in life. The Washington Post, June 1893. Remains of extraordinary size uncovered in a Minnesota burial mound, accompanied by copper artifacts suggesting sophisticated metallurgical knowledge. The Indianapolis News, November 1879. Skeleton measuring over 8 feet unearthed by farmers digging a new well. The skull alone reportedly twice the size of a normal human head. The Middletown Signal, 1899. Giant human remains found in Ohio alongside tools and ornaments that suggested the individual had held some position of importance in whatever society had buried him with such care. The Worthington Advance, 1897. 10 skeletons of enormous size discovered in a Minnesota mound, each measuring between 7 and 8 feet, arranged in a deliberate pattern that implied organized burial practices rather than random interment. These weren't fringe publications inventing stories to sell papers. These were the newspapers of record for their communities, the same papers that covered local politics and agricultural prices and the everyday documentation of American life. And they reported giant skeletons with the same matter-of-fact tone they used for everything else. Because at the time, these discoveries weren't controversial. They weren't impossible. They were simply news. Unusual enough to warrant coverage, but not so extraordinary that reporters felt the need to defend or contextualize what they were describing. I started building a database. Every clipping I could find across digitized archives and microfilm collections and the forgotten files of historical societies that hadn't yet been absorbed into larger institutional frameworks. Every reference, every measurement, every location, every detail about what was found alongside the bones. The numbers became impossible to dismiss as coincidence or error. Between 1850 and 1920, I documented over 300 separate newspaper reports of giant skeleton discoveries across the United States alone. 300 independent accounts, not scattered randomly across the country, but clustering in specific regions with a precision that suggested pattern, rather than chance. The Ohio Valley, the Mississippi River Basin, the Great Lakes region, the areas densest with burial mounds, with earthworks, with the architectural remnants of whatever civilization had occupied this landscape before European settlement. And here's where the official explanation begins to collapse under the weight of its own inadequacy. We're told these reports were misidentifications, that 19th century Americans, despite their familiarity with death and burial and human anatomy, somehow consistently mistook animal bones for human remains, that mastodon fossils were confused for giant men, that elk skeletons were misinterpreted as oversized humans, that the measurements were exaggerated, the descriptions embellished, the entire phenomenon nothing more than a collective failure of observation by people who didn't know what they were looking at. But the reports don't read like mistakes. They read like documentation. Measurements are specific, recorded with the precision of people who understood that details matter. 7 feet 4 inches in 8t2 in 9 feet 1 inch. Not round numbers that might suggest estimation, but exact figures that imply actual measurement with actual instruments by people who took their observations seriously. Anatomical details are noted with consistency across reports from different states, different decades, different newspapers, with no apparent connection to one another. Double rows of teeth appearing in multiple accounts separated by years and hundreds of miles. Unusually thick skull bones mentioned again and again. Proportions that remained recognizably human despite the extraordinary scale. Jawbones that could fit over normal human faces. Femurs that exceeded normal length by 18 in or more. These weren't confused farmers mistaking mastodon remains for human ancestors. These were detailed observations recorded by witnesses who knew exactly what human skeletons looked like because they lived in an era when death was present, when people prepared their own dead for burial, when human anatomy wasn't an abstraction hidden away in medical schools but a reality encountered in everyday life. They knew what they were seeing, and what they were seeing was human but not normal, familiar but wrong in scale. The geographical clustering alone suggests something more systematic than random misidentification. Why would mistakes concentrate so precisely in specific river valleys? What would confused observers across different states, different decades, different newspapers with different editors and different standards all make the same errors with the same specific details? Why would the reports align so consistently in their descriptions if each one was simply an independent failure of observation? The pattern implies something the official narrative cannot accommodate. Not error, but evidence, not confusion, but documentation of something that existed in sufficient quantities to be regularly encountered by people digging in certain regions during a specific period of American history. And then there's the Smithsonian, the institution that was supposed to study these remains, the National Repository of Scientific Knowledge, where skeleton after skeleton was supposedly sent for expert analysis and preservation. The organization whose entire purpose was to collect and protect exactly this kind of evidence for future generations of researchers. When looking for records, the intake documents that should exist for specimens received from across the country, the study results that should have been published when unusual remains were examined by trained scientists, the current locations of specimens that should still exist somewhere in storage, if they were ever actually preserved as the historical record suggests they were. What I found was absence-shaped, like evidence. The Smithsonian acknowledges receiving numerous skeletal remains from 19th century excavations. Their own annual reports from the 1880s and 1890s reference acquisitions of unusual specimens with language that suggests the institution knew these materials were significant enough to warrant special mention. Letters from field researchers describe shipping remains to Washington with expectations that proper study would follow. But when modern researchers request access to giant skeletal material specifically, they're told no such specimens exist in the current collection. Lost, misplaced, never properly accessioned despite documentation suggesting otherwise, disposed of during routine collection, management at some unspecified point in institutional history, destroyed in moves between facilities, damaged beyond recognition and discarded. The explanations vary, but the result is consistent. The skeletons are gone. Hundreds of specimens exposed across the continent over 7 decades, exposed by reputable witnesses, reported by mainstream newspapers, sent to the nation's premier scientific institution with the expectation of study and preservation, and somehow every single one has vanished without adequate explanation, without documentation of disposal, without any record of what happened between their arrival in Washington and their current absence from any accessible collection. This raises questions that no one in official channel seems willing to address directly. These skeletons were misidentified animal bones, as the dismissive explanation suggests. Why were they accepted by the Smithsonian at? Why would trained scientists receive shipments of elk remains and file them as significant anthropological specimens worthy of preservation? Why would the institution's own annual reports reference these acquisitions with language suggesting scientific importance if they were obviously misidentified by even basic examination? And if they were genuine human remains of unusual size, where are they now? Where is the documentation of their disposal? Where is the scientific record explaining why hundreds of specimens were deemed unworthy of preservation? Where is the institutional paper trail that should exist for any systematic accessioning of archaeological materials? The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but the systematic removal of evidence, the coordinated disappearance of physical materials that were documented every stage except their final disposition, suggests something more deliberate than negligence. You don't lose 300 specimens through carelessness. You don't misplace an entire category of archaeological material through routine bureaucratic failure. Something else is happening. Decision made at some point that certain discoveries were better forgotten than explained. I found myself asking why. Why would institutions invested in understanding human history actively work to suppress evidence of human biological diversity? What narrative was being protected? What assumptions about human development and civilizational progress were so precious that physical evidence had to be removed from the record rather than examined on its own terms? And that's when the timeline became impossible to ignore. The newspaper reports cluster between 1850 and 1920. They peak in the 1880s and 1890s, exactly when excavation of burial mounds was most active, when amateur archaeology was still permitted, when discoveries could be made and reported, before institutional frameworks controlled what was allowed to be faux. Then they stop, not gradually as you might expect, if a genuine phenomenon was simply becoming rarer, through excavation of available sites, abruptly, almost completely. After approximately 1920, mainstream newspapers simply ceased reporting giant skeleton discoveries. But excavations didn't stop. Archaeological digs continued throughout the 20th century. Burial mounds were still being explored, still being documented, still yielding artifacts and remains that were carefully cataloged and preserved. The only thing that changed was what got reported, what was considered newsworthy, what was allowed to enter the public record. Consider what else was happening in the early 20th century. Academic disciplines were consolidating their authority. Anthropology and archaeology were establishing institutional control over what constituted legitimate research and legitimate findings. Narratives about human development were being standardized, taught in universities, published in textbooks that would shape understanding for generations. Framework was being constructed. Human height exists within certain parameters. Human civilization developed in certain ways. Human history follows certain patterns. And that framework had no room for giants, no accommodation for evidence that suggested physical diversity beyond accepted limits. No Space for discoveries that implied something different about the recent past than what the textbooks were beginning to teach. The timing aligns too precisely to be coincidental. The last giant skeleton reports appear in mainstream newspapers just as academic institutions are cementing their authority over archaeological interpretation. The specimens disappear from collections just as museums are becoming the gatekeepers of what evidence is allowed to exist. The questions stop being asked just as asking them becomes professionally dangerous. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The newspaper archive is still there. The clippings still exist in digitized collections and microfilm rolls and the files of local historical societies. The evidence persists for anyone willing to look with eyes unclouded by assumptions about what they're allowed to find. But looking requires accepting uncomfortable possibilities that the authorities might be wrong, that the textbooks might be incomplete, that institutions we trust to preserve knowledge might sometimes destroy it when that knowledge threatens the narratives those institutions were built to protect. Keep returning to the casualness of those original newspaper reports. The reporters weren't breathless or sensational. They documented unusual finds with the professional detachment of people doing their jobs, recording what they observed without apparent concern that their observations might later be declared impossible. The skeletons were newsworthy but not world-shattering, remarkable but not unbelievable. That ordinariness haunts me more than anything else. In the 1800s, the existence of very tall human beings was not considered inherently impossible. It was documented because it was interesting, but it didn't threaten anyone's worldview. It was simply part of the spectrum of human variation that Americans were encountering as they excavated a landscape full of evidence that someone else had been here first. Something changed between then and now, not in the ground but in our willingness to see what the ground contains. The skeletons didn't stop existing. We stopped acknowledging them. We built frameworks that excluded them, and then we forgot that the exclusion was a choice. We made the impossible impossible by definition, and then we declared those definitions natural and inevitable and beyond question. The massive burial mounds still dot the landscape. The newspaper archives still preserve what the institutions have tried to forget. The evidence waits for anyone willing to ask the questions that everyone else has agreed not to ask. Oh, were these people? Where did their remains actually go? Why did the report stop so suddenly? Why does the institutional silence persist so completely? And perhaps most disturbing of all, if 300 newspaper reports of giant skeleton discoveries can be effectively erased from collective memory within a single century, what else might have been erased? What other categories of evidence have we been trained not to see? What else have we been taught to forget? The ground holds what it holds. The archives preserve what they preserve.